Today we're going to talk about recovery of human remains. Then we're going to talk about how do we operate in a morgue. We're going to talk about become familiar with the search and excavation techniques, and then we'll learn about the different stages of decomposition. Because you're going to go out there and you're going to find some remains, surface remains, things of that nature, and it's always good to be able to talk on a level with the forensic pathologists, anthropologists, and other law enforcement. And when we get done, you should be able to identify visual signs which assist in locating remains. That's one of the more difficult things we'll do. Actually processing the remains isn't that difficult. Finding them usually is. You should be able to identify the different decomp stages and identify what items of evidence that we normally find at some of these scenes and what you should be looking for. Dr. Wayne Lord was here yesterday. He didn't have time to see us. That's always been one of his sayings. Basically, God has a plan for you when you no longer need the package. You come in as a human being. And Wayne's an entomologist, and we'll talk about what the insects do to your body after you're dead. Okay, one of the things we've talked about are specialists, and when we're in the field of human remains recovery, we're going to depend on several specialists. One is the forensic anthropologist. They specialize in the skeleton itself. They're not so concerned with the tissue on the body. They're concerned with the skeleton itself. Like we saw in the case I talked about from Albania, once the tissue was, to get the tissue out of there, they rendered the remains and got it down to clean bone. That's what they want to look at. And they're very good at assessing remains for evidence of trauma, broken bones, cut marks. We saw the saw marks in those remains. But what can the anthropologists do for us? Well, they can give us the sex of the individual, male or female. But they need certain parts of the body, certain bones to do that, the pelvis, the skull being very, very important in that. Age, if they have pelvis, teeth, skull, and some of the long bones, they can give us a rough estimate on age. Once we hit 25 years of age, it's all downhill for us. There's really not that much change in the body as far as the bones. You're fully matured as far as your bones are going to mature at around the age of 25. Now, there's other things that happen on that downslope, arthritis, things of that nature that can help in identification, injuries, breaks, heals, and stuff like that, the healing of the bone that can help. But up to age 25, it's difficult to determine age. Stature, how tall was this individual? And basically what they do is, one of the big things they have at the University of Tennessee is their reference library of all the bones. Every body that gets laid out and studied for decomposition down there at the university, and right now there's probably about 110 bodies out. Once they're done with the decomp study, then they clean the bones, they bring them in, they measure all the bones, they do all the calculations, and then they're put into the library. They can also give us ethnic groups, race, and most of that is based on having the skull and teeth. Then there's a forensic archaeologist. But they're real good at locating the remains, locating the grave site. They're very, very good. They get a lot of training in documenting the grave site and mapping. Then we have the botanist. They specialize in the study of plant life. They show patterns. They can show plant growth patterns. One of the bodies we had down there at the university one time had a plant going right through the rib cage with the roots kind of intertwining through the rib cage, and that for them is a great find because they can take that root, they can look at the plant, they can go back over environmental conditions, temperature, rainfall, humidity, that type, and give an age on that plant and at what point in time it went through the rib cage. All this to help us determine time of death or time when the body was placed there. And the other thing is you may have a body killed in one location and brought to another location, and they can make a differentiation between the plants from different regions. They're very good and helpful at that. Then we have the entomologist. They study insects, and they know the life cycles of flies and how that can help us in determining time of death. Because if you have a body outside, you're going to have flies. And they teach at the University of Tennessee, at our school down there, we learn the proper methods of collection, preservation of the insects, the larvae, everything, and we'll go through the whole sequence. Basically, once you die, the flies are there as quick as possible. When we were over in Kosovo digging graves, basically we would dig a grave in this corner of the room, and in that corner of the room we would have a pop-up tent. We'd have a pathologist and anthropologist right there in the field doing the post-mortem. Myself and another agent from Cleveland, we went down, we collected a body, all Tyvek'd up, laid it at the top of the grave, climbed out of the grave, picked the body up, and by the time I laid it over there at the tent, I started to notice eggs forming in the nostrils. I mean, it's that quick. They come in, they start dumping eggs. It's a very quick process. And down at the University of Tennessee, Dr. Rodriguez did a study one time. He collected some flies over on campus, and he collected them and he painted red dots on their underside. They went ahead and they put a fresh body out at the facility. He released the flies. And we're talking about 1.5 miles difference with the Tennessee River dividing the campus from the facility. And when he went over there and started collecting flies, he was collecting some of the flies that he had left over at, and painted over at the campus. So they'll get there and they'll get there fast and they'll start dropping their eggs. And basically what they do is they'll come in, they'll lay their eggs, and I'll show you some examples of that. Then the eggs will hatch into maggots. There's 3 stages of the maggots: the first instar, second instar, third instar. This is what the entomologist can look at and tell you what stages. It's pretty much size, maturity. Children, teenagers, adults, that's the way they explain it to us. And then what happens is the maggot will start eating off the body. It'll start eating the flesh and everything. Now the maggot or any of the insects aren't going to go and eat through the skin. What they're going to do is they're going to go to the natural openings, nose, ear, everywhere else, and then they'll start laying their eggs in there. If you have a mass of eggs or you have a mass of maggots, say on the chest, then you know if you clean that off, you probably got some type of wound right there, because they're not going to eat through the flesh. They're going to go through a wound or some type of natural opening. So then they're going to eat on the body until they get enough nutrients, and then they're going to crawl off the body. Now, usually, sometimes, and with an ALS, sometimes in a pristine area in the woods and stuff like that, you can light it up, or even with natural lighting and normal eyesight, you can look and you can start seeing trails where they travel off the body. You know, the greases and everything from the body are adherent to them, and they're all following each other off the body, and sometimes you can see these maggot trails going off. What they'll do is they'll come off the body and they'll bury themselves very shallow off the underneath the surface, and then they'll pupate, and they'll get this hard casing around them. Then what will happen over time, again depending a lot on environmental conditions, temperature, humidity, they'll hatch and they'll go back into, come back as a fly. So that's the whole cycle of the fly. Now what we do at a scene is we'll go ahead and we'll collect whatever we have there and give that to the entomologist, and they can sit down, they can look at the environmental conditions, and they can give us a pretty good estimate of time of death. That's all you have. They're very good at giving us time of death. Again, I talked about this. The insects won't chew through skin. They're going to look for natural body openings or wounds. The season of the murder or death can be determined, sometimes even more specific than that. The body is an excellent source of protein for the bugs, and about 80% of the body weight is consumed by bugs if it's left out or buried in a shallow grave. So we all got that to look forward to. The other specialist, and these are very helpful, is the forensic odontologist. Forensic odontologist is a dentist, with further training, and most of them that we work with are board certified. And we'll talk about board certification in the next part. But they can assist in the identification through dental records, and they are extremely helpful. If you've got an unidentified body, or you have an identified body, but there's no positive identification, somebody said, hey, that's so-and-so, and you have no skin tissue to do fingerprints, or you have no prints on file, antemortem prints, then you can go ahead and get with the forensic odontologist, get some dental records, and they can do a comparison, and it's usually pretty quick with them if they have the records. They can come out there and x-ray. When I was over in Thailand for the tsunami, that was one of the biggest methods that we were using for identification. There's a lot of the victims over there that didn't have fingerprints on file, so we were unable to identify them with fingerprints. Like I said, we had all the issues with DNA over there. It was taking long. But for all those cases where we were able to get antemortem records on dental, they were able to knock out a lot of dental identifications. And when you go on a major airplane crash, and if you go through the morgue, one of the main stations that they'll have set up in the morgue is odontology for the identification. Toxicologist, that's usually something that's going to happen once the body gets to the morgue. They're going to go ahead and take sections. They're going to go ahead and remove fluids, and they're going to send it off for toxicology. They have their standard list of which they ask for, and if there's anything in the case that determines otherwise, they can ask for other testing to be done. But basically, poisons, drugs, alcohol, which can be poison, and can be considered a drug. Okay, now we're talking about the search. Preliminary, if you're working the case or you're out there as an ER team member, you want to make sure that all witnesses have been interviewed that last seen the victim, and this can kind of help you to target an area of investigation. A lot of times we're going to go out on these cases and it's going to be a needle in a haystack. But to keep in mind is when we're doing the search, there's two types of sites. One is the quick dump, where usually the homicide isn't pre-planned. Something rises to the event, somebody gets killed, they try to dispose of the body, and that's usually a pretty quick dump. Planned concealment is something that's usually pre-planned. They may pre-dig a grave with heavy equipment, or they may do the concealment on their own property so that nobody comes across it. But a planned concealment puts a little bit more thought into it and makes it a little bit more difficult to find. This was a case down in Honolulu. It was on the side of the road. That's kind of a quick dump. Usually, if you talk to the BAU guys that we talked about the other day, the area is unknown to the subject. There's usually a high probability of discovery, easily accessible location, and could be close to the murder site. So they're going down the road, they got a dead body in the car with them, they're going to pick an opportune spot, just dump it out and go. They're not going to drag it way back into the woods, they're not going to dig a deep grave to put the body in, to hide the body, and stuff like that. I had a case when I was up in Michigan of a 4-year-old missing. She was missing for 9 months, and there was a road crew out there that was doing some work on the side of the road. One of the guys saw something white and shiny, and it was actually the bleached skull that was laying there, and came across, and the body was probably about 6 feet off the side of the road. That was a quick dump. Planned concealments, again, subject knows the area well, and it could be their property or controlled by them. And they sometimes take additional measures to further conceal concrete. You know, Gacy in Chicago, the serial killer there, he put a garage on the back of his house, put a barbecue pit in, and all that is to hide some of the bodies. Those are plant concealments. They're pretty confident that the body will not be discovered, and it's not in a highly populated or traveled area normally. If you've got somewhat of a fresh grave, and a fresh grave means within the year, you can look for some vegetation differences, damaged vegetation, or you may have a patch of real fertile area where everything else is kind of yellowed out and this area is real green. Or you may have a lack of plant growth, you know, where the acids and everything come out and have wilted away the plants in that patch. All depends on the area where the body is. But you're looking for that difference. You're also looking for a difference in soil. You know, you may find a pile of turned dirt, even if it's been a year. You know, you've got this whole 5-acre area and everything is the same, and then you've got this unnatural pile of dirt. Well, think about it. If I dig a grave and I put a 250-pound person in there, I'm not going to fit all that dirt back in. You know, so I'm going to have a little bit of a pile somewhere. So those are the types of things that you're going to be looking for out there. Again, some plants will appear sick looking, burned out and stuff like that from the ammonia gases or the dark areas in some. And one of the exercises we do down at the University of Tennessee with the teams is we walk them through, we give them a section of the facility and say, go find the grave. And what I tell them every year is if you can't find a grave site at this facility, we're going to need to send you home, because they've planted hundreds of people down there over the years. Another thing that we're going to look for is the soil compaction, depressions in the soil. You may have a single depression. If I take a fresh body, I dig a standard grave, which is about 2.5 feet. That's about as deep as they get. And that body goes in there. Eventually, the gases are going to build up in the body during the decomposition rate, and at some point, the body's going to release those gases. Okay, and I'll show you a good example of it later. But so you're going to have this up, and then all of a sudden, everything's going to settle. So you're going to have this little depression in the soil where the gases have settled, the secondary depression. You may see visible cracks in the soil, and one of the things that we'll do, here we go, here's an example. Here you can see around this tree here, we have pretty normal standard soil here, and then we've got this depression. Now you go out there and say, hey, is that from rain? Is that from water runoff or something like that? So the next step that we'll do is we'll get a probe. And I don't have it yet in the picture, but a probe is just a bar with a handle, and what you'll do is you'll start probing that area, and you'll feel the compaction. Everything is the same, and then all of a sudden, whoo, it's real loose soil here. So then you'll try to go around and get your grave outline. Now, don't be thinking in terms of a cemetery, you know, where you got the 3-foot by 6-foot perfectly dug rectangle, because somebody's going to go out there and dig, and it may be in a circle. It's probably going to be more round than it is square. Then you got visual indications of body location. If we dig down 3-4 feet in soil and you look at that wall, you're going to see a variation in colors depending on the depth. If I dig and I throw that soil out, now I'm mixing all this soil. So you may see that little pile, and it may have yellowish clay in it, and it may have reddish soil, all kind of mixed and look kind of marbleized in there. And then you look at the regular soil, and everything is reddish clay. Then you know something's been turned over there. And again, when I talked about the residue left, you know, I can't put the same amount of dirt in after putting a 250-pound person back in the soil. The other thing that you may see on the ground on the surface is bones, hair, jewelry. Okay? If it's a shallow grave, some of the local critters are going to come in there and they're going to pull away and take some stuff off that body. If you got a high presence of beetles, that might be another indication that they're down there eating. Or look for the fly larvae or the pupa casings that we talked about earlier, and I'll show you some examples of that later in here. Look for tool marks or other evidence left behind. Somebody might be using a pick, and you might have this pristine wooded area, and you've got some kind of tool mark in the tree behind it. But again, teeth, they start falling out quickly. What you'll find is your hands and your feet have the majority of bones in your body. They're all small bones and stuff like that, and you may see those laying around scattered around the burial site. But once we found our grave site, one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to flag all the evidence that's around there. We're going to document it just like we do. We're going to photograph it, we're going to sketch it, and then we're going to collect it properly. And then we're going to try and determine the outline of our grave. And a lot of that will be done, again, by doing the probing. And then we'll set up the outline of the grave to be excavated. Now we'll talk about the excavation. What type of equipment do we need? Obviously, shovels, rakes, hand tools. We're not going to sit there with a shovel and dig till we get to the bone. Okay? It's a slow, methodical dig. Most of the digging, you'll see some examples here, is with small trowels, and people are on their hands and knees. Our graves down in Tennessee usually are 2.5 to 3 feet deep, and I can always tell when it's Thursday. That's the second day they're digging out there, because all you see is everybody's in Tyvek and a bunch of white butts hanging down into these graves, because that's how slow we take it. And you're on your hands and knees or laying flat on your belly doing that. You're going to need some sifting equipment, because all the dirt that we take out we're going to sift, usually down to at least 1/4 of an inch, because we're looking for any type of artifact, shell casings, anything. The other thing is, I talked about before, that body starts breaking down. The teeth will start falling out at some point in time, so you're going to find teeth in these siftings, and you're going to find a lot of hand and foot bone. We're going to need string, to set up our grids, marking flags, a line level, to put on there. The plumb bob I talked about, tarps. Normally I'll lay a tarp down, and when I'm done with the dirt, I'll put the dirt on top of the tarp. I usually have one out for evidence, anything that we find as we go along. Metal detector is a great thing to have there. As you're going through, use the metal detector. People get buried with boots and belts on and stuff like that that'll set off the metal detector. The other thing is, when we're all done and we find that body, we're not all done. We want to make sure that once the body's removed, that the soil starts becoming consistent, or maybe we've got a second body there, and I'll usually go into the grave and run a metal detector to make sure we haven't missed anything there. A compass for doing our mapping, buckets to move the dirt out, plastic sheeting, packaging items, and PPE. Again, it's a crime scene, and we're going to do it just as a crime scene. We're going to photograph the scene, all the evidence in place, without scale, long range, medium range, close up. We're going to do a sketch and probably have somebody out there with the laptop keeping all the notes of what's going on, all the administrative information. And then we're going to begin the excavation. Photograph the scene as found. Photograph the burial site once it's clear to the leaves and vegetation. If it's the fall and you're out there and you've felt this outline, then what we're going to do is we're going to remove everything, usually leaf by leaf, to make sure we don't miss anything off this potential grave site. And then we're going to photograph all the evidence in place, again, with and without scale. Sketch, we're going to grid the burial site. We talked about that using the string or rope. Grid assist with the measurements and noting items on the sketch, and then plot all your evidence and remains on the sketch. And again, I'll show you some examples. It's a rough sketch. This is one of the digs we did down there in Tennessee. You don't have to be an artist. The Nikon Total Station is very useful. That's where we tested the equipment. We took it down there with a clean skeleton at the bottom of a grave, and we shot all the endpoints of the bone. You end up with a very accurate, very to scale drawing. As we excavate, we're going to take layers off in small increments. Again, like I said, with hand tools. Everything gets sifted, and we're looking for small bones, coins, teeth, bullets, anything that's not natural to that area. Here you see the slow process. Now, we got this big hole right here. Remember what I was talking about earlier about the body being filled with gases and then gases releasing? That's what we're talking about there. But you can see how slow the team's going. Everything gets put in a bucket. There's another crew over there doing the sifting operation. Now we're getting down. Now, see that chest cavity? How depressed that is? Well, this guy was about 450 pounds, so it's a little exaggerated. And what we want to end up with is we want to pedestal this body when we're done. We want to clean all over the top, all around the sides, and part way underneath, so it's just sitting on this pedestal to make sure that we've gotten everything. A lot of times if you dig a grave, and maybe it's a little moist once you get down there and stuff like that, and you're going to drag the body in there and you step into the grave, you throw the body down, you step out. When you pick that body up, there's a beautiful shoe impression in that mud preserved, and you're able to go in there and look for that. The other thing is look for any tool impressions. You may be able to look and measure the size of the spade or whatever the type of shovel that was used just by cleaning down to the walls of the grave that they dug. Again, same thing on evidence, usual packaging. All evidence gets packaged separate. Then we usually collect a soil sample from the burial site, and we collect a couple samples from around the burial site. That way later, if they get a suspect, and let's say he's got soil on his shoes, or he's got soil underneath his car where he drove out to the site, we can do a comparison there. Insects, again, they get packaged in glass with alcohol, 70% solution to be preserved and sent back.